Don, Barrie from Peterborough, and Don has a career with the lacrosse that stems back into the 40s, believe it or not. He doesn't look a day over 50 to me. And, has been a player, a coach, has been a builder of the game, has been involved with Canada's national team, just has been in the pro leagues as a coach. So we're going to look into this a little bit today and look at not really the life and times of Don Barrie, but some of the key moments for the game. And Don has seen a lot, so we're going to find out more about this game through Don today. Biggest question since we're in Peterborough at the Peterborough Sports Hall of Fame at the Memorial Arena, and it's a beautiful facility and so much history here. Lacrosse played a big part of the history here in Peterborough. How did it get started in Peterborough? Do you know how it developed?
Yeah, it started back, of course, way back in the field era. Like Peterborough was, they had a lot of Irish and Scottish settlers come in and so on, so soccer and cricket were big. And in 1872, a gentleman introduced lacrosse to the area. And it was, so he got some of the younger clerks that worked in stores and so on, and they learned the game down along the river in Peterborough here, and they formed a couple of teams, sort of like a junior team and a senior team. And they called the senior team the Red Rosettes. I have no idea where that name came from. It sort of doesn't fit in with the idea of lacrosse or Peterborough itself. But anyway, so field lacrosse took off really well here, and within 15 years, we were one of the dominant field lacrosse areas in Ontario. And in fact, we even hosted the world champion Montreal Wanderers here in Peterborough. They came in for an exhibition game. In those days, field lacrosse was, they were called games, went one goal. As soon as a goal was scored, it was a game. So you would play maybe 3 out of 5 games, much as we play in playoffs now that way. So I think the Wanderers beat us 3-0 or something. You know, they were a professional team. Newsy Lalonde was on it. And, so that's how the peak of it. But then during the early 1900s, during the war, it fell completely off. And there was virtually no lacrosse in this area. And it started to get resurrected in the 1920s. There was a few field teams around, but it was more the Norwoods and the Lakefields and the areas around. And it just really didn't take off until box lacrosse was invented. It was, of course, invented in 1931, and Peterborough was one of the first teams to take off. In 1932, we started to play box lacrosse here in the city.
So when the Wanderers came, was that like 1907 or 1906?
No, it was 1895 in that area, 1894.
Okay, because I know of Newsy Lalonde playing out for the Salmon Bellies.
Yes.
In the early 1900s. So
yes, I don't know if Newsy was actually, he played for the Wanderers, if he was on that team that came here, or if it was a seconds or something that came in. But it was a big deal because they had a parade through the city and they carried their World Championship banner with them. The Wanderers did across. It was played across the river in the cricket pitch across what we call East City or Ashburnham today. We didn't have a decent field here in city. There was really 2 towns then, Ashburnham and Peterborough, divided by the river.
And was that banner, they used to play for the Claxton Banners in the late 1860s or 1870s.
Yeah.
Would that
I don't know. They just said that they marched, like I just doing the research from my book. Right. It just was in the paper. It mentioned that the Wanderers marched across the bridge carrying their championship banner, world championship banner. So I don't know what an actual banner was.
All right. Well, that's something I've got to try to find out when they stopped using the Claxton banner, and from the early days. So there was a transition from field to box here, and so what what was unique about that transition?
Well, the thing that we really just walked away from field. The one year we had a field team and it played in the county league around here. The next year, gone. We're playing in the only indoor rink we have here. It was called the Brock Street Arena, and they played on a dirt floor indoors. Box. It was 7-a-side, of course, box in those days, with no subs. And but we got involved, and we were playing against Aurelia and Toronto and a few of the teams. And within the second year, I think we won one of the championships at one of the divisions.
And then at some point they started creating like the Miller Bowl, like outdoor bowls that they played in here, right?
Yeah, it got so darn hot in the arena that eventually they built a bowl, which they called the George Street Stadium. And they built it down, if anybody knows Peterborough, across from the marina here on our main street, George Street now. And it was used in the late 30s. And then during the war, of course, all the players went away to the war. And what happened was the city commandeered the bowl and stored metal for the war effort in there, took trucks in and ruined the bowl. So when the boys came back from after the war in 1945, all hell broke loose in the city. Here they come back after fighting the war, and the city had basically wrecked their lacrosse bowl that they had built. They built it themselves. And it had held a couple of thousand people, so it was a substantial effort. It was an outdoor bowl, of course.
Yes.
So the city scrambled, and they gave them some land, and then the famous Miller Bowl was built in '47.
Okay.
And lacrosse took off then. And they had up to 4,000 people, if you can believe it, in an outdoor bowl. And we started to import players, and we became really lacrosse a powerhouse in the country, and won four Man Cups in a row, 51 to 54, with import players.
Now, was Miller a benefactor or?
He was an old lacrosse field player, and he was one of the ones that got the money together. And he was, I think, eventually was on city council, but he pulled enough strings, and they got money together, and the players built the bowl themselves physically. They went down, and I remember my dad taking me down. I was not 8, 7. And I'd go down, and then my dad would work on it, and they'd be nailing, and they'd be building the darn bowl themselves, and it became a community project.
So that, basically made by those who would use it. And,
Yes, yeah.
So pretty special that way.
Yeah.
And then I understand around 1957, the game started to move indoors.
Well, what happened, the city, this land became pretty popular down there along the lake.
Right.
So the city said, they gave it $1 lease to the lacrosse. They said, we're going to revoke the lease. So after 10 years, they revoked the lease on the bowl, but the Peterborough Memorial Center had opened in '56.
Okay.
So they said, well, you can go and play indoor. Well, it didn't transfer well. People were used to being outside, and it really struggled. And by 61, senior was gone in the city.
Wow.
And we went 3-4 years without senior lacrosse because it flopped indoors. People didn't like it. It was hot in there, and players didn't come, and so it didn't. The transfer didn't work well.
It seems like sometimes the city higher-ups didn't treat the game with maybe the respect that the people wanted.
Not at all. There's always been animosity between the city and lacrosse. Going back prior to that, they tore down the bowls on them, and then forcing them out of the Miller Bowl into the Memorial Center here, and right up to today, we have issues with the city and the way they treat lacrosse that really split the community down the middle. Those that support lacrosse and are upset with the city, and then the people that don't care about lacrosse and don't care what the city's doing to it.
But the city gets a lot of its identity from the game. Like it's really helped put it
Well,
Peterborough on the map.
this is the ironic thing about it, that they lacrosse is the most popular sport in the city, and Peterborough, I think, though a couple of cities may argue with us, is the most popular, efficient, and well-run lacrosse organization in Canada. I mean, we draw crowds in here that are up to 4,000 in some games, you know,
Yeah.
for Man Cups and so on. So no other community in across Canada has that kind of record.
In the early 2000s, there was a big boom, I guess, for the game, or boost.
Well, they did a renovation here at the Memorial Center, and they put in air conditioning. And then people started to come back slowly, and some money came into the game. Teddy Higgins did a lot of work around here and got the thing reorganized, and they started to import players again. And in '04, we had a championship team here and won the Man Cup. And we had great crowds, and it's taken off since then. And for the next 15 years up to now, we've had, you know, averaging over 3,000, a lot of games over the season here. So it was the air conditioning and winning lacrosse that made the difference.
And did you have a fair number of NLL players playing for you at that time? Or?
Oh, at one time, or even now, practically every player on the Lakers also plays on an NLL team. Yeah, there was, see, the NLL sort of took off at that time too, so the players became summer and winter lacrosse players.
Was your brother Tim involved with the team at that stage? Or?
Tim took over the president of the junior team.
Junior team. Okay.
Yeah, and in 04 or 06, they won the Minto Cup. And he brought in a couple of players that ended up in the NLL, and the juniors took off. Now, the juniors have had some tough times of late with players and so on, but they had a pretty good run there for a while. Many of the players are on that Man Cup team, or that Minto Cup team, have been on the Man Cup teams for the Lakers.
I see. And what's different about this community versus others, the way lacrosse is perceived, do you think?
It's a unique community as far as lacrosse, because I think it's so, it goes back so far, and we've had so much success. And in those early days, we brought in a lot of players. We imported a lot of players, but most of them stayed and took jobs here. Like, they would come in here not for money, but to get a job, because we had a pretty thriving industrial complex here in the city, 4 or 5 major factories that were hiring back in the early 50s, late 40s. And so those guys stayed, and they stayed and coached, and they stayed and added to the game. And the one thing about us, we're somewhat isolated here from Toronto, so we, the outsiders say we're inbred, but we sort of look inward with our coaching and so on, and we develop a fairly unique style of the game that other teams soon followed. We had some very innovative coaches like Bobby Allen here who brought things to the game from basketball that people never thought of. And it grew that way. So we got a unique style of the way we played, much like some countries have a unique style with their soccer or with their hockey. We have an identifiable way we play lacrosse, I think, and that's unique to the game.
So obviously you know a lot about the history of the game, and you decided to document it through some books that you've written.
Yeah, like I've been writing a column for the Examiner for 25 years, and so I started to pull together some of the stories. I write quite a bit about lacrosse, and so I ended up publishing a book in the early 2000s on the history of lacrosse. I think it would come out in 2004, and then I updated it in 2009. And it was kind of interesting going back through the archives out at the university here, Trent University, and reading the newspapers and so on, and how lacrosse, because that was the other thing, the papers really supported the lacrosse in the day. Like some communities, you could read the paper, you wouldn't even know there was a lacrosse game that night.
Yeah.
Well, the media in this city is very, very strong with supporting the game. So there was a lot of good records on the game, and it made it such that it was easier to research.
And that's a lot like Baltimore in the U.S., where
Yes.
it's always in the papers,
Yeah.
the game. And
Yep,
a few
that's right.
places.
And Johns Hopkins, and yeah.
And so what, you wrote 2 novels about the game. There's not
Yeah.
many lacrosse novels written.
No.
So how did that all come about?
Well, it just came about because of stories. You know, after I'd done the research, I said, you know, like there were so many characters in the game, and you heard stories about them, you know. You don't know how true they were, or how, you know, about things that happened. So I thought, well, I could write a novel and include these in there, and it's fiction, but it's from stuff that players did and heard. And the first one that did Moon and Me, about a 10-year-old boy that had polio and couldn't play outdoors in lacrosse, but went to the lacrosse school like I did, and so he became a goalie. And then Moon Wooten came into the city, and I knew Moon not well. I played one lacrosse game on the same team with him. I was a juvenile, and they brought me up to play senior for one game, and Moon was in goal, and we played up in Owen Sound. But so I created a relationship between this star goalie and this kid with polio that was really a backup goalie and at Pee Wee. And it's just about a year in the life of the two of them. Moon Wooten's team went on and won the Mann Cup in 51, and this little guy played on a Pee Wee team that got beat out in the first game at the Pee Wee tournament. But and that was with the team I played on. We played one game all year. We had no exhibition games. We went to the Pee Wee Championships in Brampton in the old Rose Bowl, and we lost our first game. It was over. That was their season. So, and then the second one was about an older guy's stories that, you know, when I was doing the research for the book, they would tell me things that I couldn't print about them. You know, like little off-cover color things and so on and so forth. So I thought, well, there's a story there. So I created a guy, and he was in St. John's Training School, and he had a German background, and it was during the war, and so he got he escaped from the St. John's Training School, which also had lacrosse, and we played lacrosse up there. It was in Scarborough, and so he escaped and went to the States, and then he got into the war, and then he came back and played lacrosse, and then I folded in all these stories about these guys that into his life, and they called him Stickman, and I had heard a story, and I don't know if it was true or not, but somebody told me that an Indigenous soldier in the war fashioned a lacrosse stick and was able to throw a grenade into a bunker or something that they couldn't throw in. And I don't know if it was a true story or not, but a native person told me that there was a guy and there was a story, and I phoned down to Six Nations. I knew a couple of people, and nobody had really, they'd heard the story of this guy, but nobody had a name or anything. So I folded that into my story. This guy, he's the guy, and he was in the army, and so that's the second novel.
Well, I've heard about World War I. They actually did throw grenades with
With-
lacrosse sticks.
Yeah,
A
yeah.
lot more distance.
Yeah.
And you didn't have to stick your head up out
No,
of the
no,
trench.
no,
You
yeah.
know what I mean?
Yeah.
So there's a
Yeah.
lot of good reasons
Yeah, yeah.
to do it. Yeah. No,
Yeah.
I've heard that.
Yeah.
But, I believe it's true. So, you've got this place where the game's held at a high regard by the people who play it, if not the city fathers. but it's held at a high regard. And where do you see the game going here, a national basis and an international basis, if you take it all the way like that?
That's I think Peterborough will always be a lacrosse community, even though they get bumped around pretty good by the city, and they've got a very, very solid fan base that goes back with people that, like I was saying, like when you're at a Man Cup game here and the people are sitting in the stands, pretty well everybody in the stands knows somebody on the floor or the uncle of somebody on the floor. They all relate to them. Unlike hockey, the junior A hockey players come in here, they're great hockey players and so on, but there's no personal relationship with any of them. So lacrosse, I think, will continue to be that way. I'm a little concerned that the way the game is going, the way it's being played, it's not as fan-friendly now, I don't think, as it was, because of the front door, back door thing. A lot of the physicality's been taken out of the game. It's a speed game now. Not that we want to go back to the old days where they were fighting and hitting each other over their head and so on,
Right,
but
right.
and I don't know if the fans will continue to follow that, but the other big thing is internationally the game is taking off. We've got a U19 girls tournament here in the city this weekend, this week, and 22 different countries are here. Like when you and I were involved in '78 and in England, 4 countries were involved in lacrosse. So that's the area, that's the growth area. And we were talking to Johnny Davis earlier today. He really feels it'll be in the Olympics in a while. I don't know about that, but it's growing. So I think that's the growth area. Where field lacrosse is not a great spectator sport compared to box lacrosse, field lacrosse is a great growth sport because it's easy to play in countries. It doesn't require a lot of equipment, fields and specialty things like that, and kids pick it up, and especially in the United States now, it's taken off. It's one of the biggest growing sports. And football is losing out because of the injury and the concussions.
Yeah.
And I think you're going to see it take off there. So that's how I see it growing.
Okay, well, they say in 2028 it's going to be in the Olympics. So
Is there?
Yeah, that's the year that they're targeting and are planning towards. And they're going to create a hybrid of the box and the field game with less players, smaller field, but try to make the game playable by both men and women.
Right.
Version, almost like
Okay.
rugby sevens.
Yeah, okay.
To
Well,
get it
that's
in the
good.
Olympics.
That's good news because, and it's going to take that, I think, to get it going. And like it was in the Olympics, Canada won the...
Yeah, 1904, 1908.
Yeah. So I hope it does come back, yeah.
It'll be great for the game, and we're up to 62 nations playing with the field lacrosse.
Right.
And that if it goes in the Olympics, that'll double that.
Oh, sure it will.
eventually,
Yeah,
That'll be,
well,
which would be
Yeah,
an amazing thing for the sport.
right.
Well, Don, I just want to thank you for your time here today, and making this facility open for us to do so many great interviews with people from Peterborough, and thank you, for allowing us to come in to share your history with you.
Okay, well, Paul Rochetta here and Pat Bronson, who are on the executive with me, helped me out today and got it open for me and taught me how to use the alarm system, or we'd be out of here by now.
All right, thanks, Don.
Okay.